Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A gute Woche and a gute Jahr. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Arena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKoyen Khan Olav Hashalom. And it is l'schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz, le'erich yamim v'shanim tevis, many healthy, long years. We're at the conclusion of chapter 3 of Tanya, Perek Gimel, and we discussed so far in the divine structure of the divine soul, not just that it's a divine identity, but its very faculties, its very building blocks. The DNA of the divine soul are all divine, beginning with the mind, Chochmah and Bina, which give in turn birth to emotions, Yira, Ava, and all their branches and derivatives. And the last class we discussed the process of how the very elements of the divine soul, the Eish, you say the Eish in the divine soul creates that passionate, fiery love. We also spoke about Yesod Hamayim, the watery and moisture connection through love and in the mind and Moyach HaChochmah. So now, if you think about it, one thing is lacking. We covered Chochmah and Bina, the father and the mother that give birth, the kernel, the seed, and its development in Bina, Chochmah and Bina, Koyach Ma, and then brought out Min HaKoyach HaLapel from the potential into the actual, or from that concentrated point into an expansive state, which in turn gave birth and awakened the Yira B'moichei, the Pachad B'libay, the awe in the mind, Yira Saremus, the Pachad, the reverence in the heart, the fiery love in the emotions as well. And then all the other emotions that are branched from there. If you go back to the beginning of the chapter, he said there were 3 imois. There were 3 mothers. Chochmah, Bina, and Das. That was the beginning of the chapter. What about Das? What is Das's role? And it's interesting, the Alter Rebbe didn't begin and say first Chochmah, Bina, and then Das. He went from Chochmah, Bina to the emotions because the parents are Chochmah and Bina. And Das deserves its own discussion now. What role does it play? There's only a father and a mother. What else is there that's necessary to give birth? Well, in the physical sense of the word, you need intimacy. You can have a father and a mother, but you need them to be bonded, to be connected. V'hoya lebasar echad, be like one flesh. In Ayin Beis and other Maimorim, it talks about that this bond that Das does is the bond between Chochmah and Bina, and also the bond between Chochmah and Bina and Midas. This is in Bereshis Tofresh Ayin Vov, in Hemshech Ayin Beis. So now we need to understand what does Das do. And we'll also understand why Das was not included right after Chochmah and Bina. It comes as a separate section here at the end of the chapter. It's critical to the picture. But as we'll see shortly, that it's not the father and mother per se, but it's still called one of the imes. Because without it, there cannot be the birth and the sustainability of true emotions. So let's learn inside, and the fascinating understanding of yet another component, another building block of the divine soul, which is called Das. So, we read on. Vahadas hu meloshin va'odam yoda es chava. The term Das means bonding, joining, fusing. connecting. And the Alter Rebbe brings from the Lashon, from the expression in the Pasuk, right in the beginning, in Bereshis, Va'odam yodas Chava. Adam knew Chava, Eve. The word knew is not just knowledge in the mind, it means bonded, connected. It's intimacy. That's the word the Torah uses for intimacy, das, which is interesting. It's not just an intellectual faculty. It's a bonding element, a connecting element. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is going to discuss. Pasuk is in Bereshis, Dalet Aleph. And what does that mean? Says the Alter Rebbe, this means, V'hu loshen is kashrus v'ischabrus. It means a bonding, a joining, a fusing, a connecting. Chochmah and Bina alone, as we're going to discuss, even when you concentrate and even when you understand something well, and there's a strong concept and conception of Chochmah, the seed, and is developed well in depth with Bina, where you understand it well and in depth and you delve into it, but you don't hear the word connection. So what connection is here that's necessary? So the Alter Rebbe explains. Shmekasher daitoi bekesher omitz v'chozak ma'od. That das is a focusing of your mind. Mekasher daitoi takes his das and bonds it, focuses it, and connects it with, in a very firm and strong bond, B'kesher omitz v'chazak, firm and strong bond. V'yataka machshavte. We're going to correct that. V'yiska machshavte. B'chezek b'gdulas ein sei baruch hu. V'yiska can be translated in different ways, but let's use the word fixation. An intense fixation and focus and concentration of thought, of the mind, on the greatness of Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the blessed infinite light. So clearly he's talking here about Elokus, because again we're talking about the divine soul. And then he adds something more. Ve'enem masiach daitei. He does not lose concentration. He does not get distracted. In other words, it's total fixation, total concentration. So let's discuss what this means. And then we'll read on for the further development of this idea. You can understand something well and be involved in not in a superficial way, but you can't say you're so absorbed in it that you lose yourself in the experience. So you can have Chochmah and Bina, understand something well, and yet doesn't mean it can be an abstract theoretical idea. It doesn't mean it's about you, that it's relevant to you, and that definitely not negay but nefesh, that it's your whole life is dependent on it. So let's use an example. It's an example actually brought in Chassidus. When a person is fixated on a beautiful image, on a beautiful masterpiece, it's not just that their mind has been attracted to it and that it's intriguing. You can become so fixated and absorbed as if nothing else is going on. Why? Because it's not just that your mind understands it, but you're connected to it. You're relating to it. So das is therefore connected, as it explains in other places, to hakara and hargosha, recognition and feeling. Even though it's not emotional, but the mind feels it's my thing. I'm relating to it. The same thing, you can be reading a book, listening to music in a superficial way, and you're experiencing something. Or you can be so absorbed in it that you lose yourself in it. That is the intimacy of das. That the knowledge is not just you know an idea. It's not just that you're gathering ideas. You're knowledgeable. As people say, person has ideas, he knows things. But no, this is a qualitative shift from an abstract understanding to a personalized one, to the point that it's completely relevant to you. And that's the reason that he's living with it and is not distracted by anything. Total concentration. And now he continues. And he says, Ki af mishu chochem v'novim b'gdula sein sei baruch hu. To explain what this really means. Because even if a person appreciates the greatness of the Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the blessed infinite light, that's the expression he's using here, understands it with Chochmah and Bina, what we've discussed till now. Hine im lo yekasher daitei v'yiska machshavte b'chezek u'ba'asmode, if he does not bond his das, focusing his mind with intensity and consistency in that type of intimate connection, lo yeled b'nafshe yira v'ava amitis, it will not produce genuine love and reverence. Actually, the order is the other way around. Reverence and love, because he's talking about the order first yira and then ava. So in his soul, they will not produce and give birth to genuine reverence and love in the person's soul. Ki'im, and look how strong this is. Ki'im dimyein shav, but only worthless delusions. In other words, you can have, yes, an inspirational moment, but it will not be sustainable. It will not become something that's etched inside the psyche of the person's mind. And therefore, the emotions, since you didn't have that concentration and that focus that it means you, it's not just an abstract theoretical idea, the emotions also are going to be dimyein shav. So though you understand it, but the emotions, which are all about my being attracted and drawn to it, or my being in reverence of it, and respecting it, the awe that we spoke about, will not be genuine, and it'll be only delusions. So let's elaborate on this and understand what this means. The Rashbatz, one of the Chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, gave an example for this. So there was a time when illiteracy was more prominent. Not everyone could read. So what did you do when you needed something to be read to you? You hired a reader. So he gives the example of a simple peasant, an illiterate person, received a letter that notified him tragically of the passing of his father, God forbid. Since he couldn't read it, he hired someone to read it for him. As the fellow was reading it, he continued reading when it came to that bad, sad news. The child, the son of this person who passed, fainted. And seemingly 1 second. The one who was reading it continued reading on. Everything is fine. And the one who was listening was only a listener. He didn't read it firsthand. He was hearing what he was reading to him. Whereas the person who was reading it actually saw the words on paper. So why did he faint and the teacher and the reader did not? The answer is because it was not his father, and this was his father. It's mein Tate. It's sein Tate. That's the difference between Chochmah, Bina, and Das. Chochmah and Bina, you can be completely aware, know everything about it. You conceive the idea, you develop it, you understand it well. Because we're not talking about, if you don't understand it well, then we're not talking what we're talking. Chochmah and Bina requires a full understanding and a depth. But it's all on the intellectual level. Das adds a component, a new component. It's not adding new understanding. It's not adding new ideas. It doesn't add information, doesn't add data. It adds a qualitative connection between you and the thing that you're studying or learning. That it becomes me. I'm absorbed. I'm personalized it. To the point that it's completely relevant to you. It's your father. Like the example I gave before with a masterpiece, or with a book, or with music. That's what Das adds. So now we understand Why Das was not included earlier? Because Chachma and Bina is the father and the mother. That's the substance. Without father and mother, you don't have the genetic, let's talk on a physical level. You don't have the genetic matter that's necessary to give birth to a child. You need the seed, you need the DNA and the genetic matter. You need the father and the mother. But what's lacking when there's a father and mother? If they're not intimate with each other, if they don't bond, they become like one, you're not going to have a birth either. So Das on one hand is critical. Without it, the birth will not happen. On the other hand, Chachma and Bina is the substance. What are you focusing on? What are you concentrating on? What are you bonding with? So basically, Das introduces the concept of bonding, fusing, connecting, personalizing, that the idea that you're learning in your mind is connected and you feel it's relevant, that it's mine. And it's an negei b'nefesh. Another example given in Chassidus is that two people who come before a bezdin, before dayanim, before judges, and they're dealing with a substantial amount of money. Now, one person could be very smart, and he's in the courtroom, he's in the bezdin, and he has all kinds of arguments, but it's not his money. He doesn't really, it's not negei b'nefesh to him. He's a hired gun, he's a consultant, he's a lawyer. But if someone who's making the argument that's negei b'nefesh, it's a substantial sum, and it's negei to his nefesh, he's mamish, it's for him life and death. He can't live without it. He's desperate, basically. It's mine. His mind will work very differently. Because the relevance and the consequences and the urgency, that's Das. So it's not just seichel itself, it's a personal connection to the seichel, to the idea. So on one hand, it's not seichel, pure intelligence. In some Maimorim it says it's not seichel, as in knowledge, as in information, as in data, as an understanding. It's about a connection, the idea, the Das, Adam Yodas Chava. On the other hand, it's one of the three moichin. You still call it a moyach hadas. Because in seichel, it adds the element of recognition, of resonance, of Hagosh. You sense that it's right. You sense the truth of the idea. Not as Chachma senses it in the beginning of the process, but this is after there's the Bina and the Chachma, and you include the Das, that type of Hamokkah, that type of immersion and bonding and connecting, that adds now the element that's critical, that intimate connection, critical for the birth, both in the physical sense of children and in the emotional sense of emotions. So the Alter Rebbe continues now. Valkein, hadas hu kiyam hamidus v'chayusan. Therefore, Das ensures the sustainability of the emotions and their energy and their vitality. Why? Because Das is ultimately that glue, that connection that really makes sure that your true emotions have been born. Because that's the connection that you have with the idea. If the idea remains abstract, it's never going to become something that's personal to you. So it's true, we're not yet in the level of pure emotions, but in the moichin itself, the mind has now moved toward a personalization of the ideas that in turn will give birth and sustain the very emotions and their vitality. Because remember, you can have the emotions, but they could also pass. They can dissipate. Now later in Tanya, he's going to talk about when it dissipates. But it could dissipate because you never had the Das in the first place. Or it could dissipate because you had it, so it remains etched in you. But other things come and distract you from it. At the time, you were totally there. Like, for example, a person who's glued, who's completely captivated, mesmerized by a sight. In this case, we're talking about the Gedula, the Gadlus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. Completely captivated and mesmerized by it. Yes, it's true later, after davening, after the contemplation, it could perhaps get concealed, but that moment remains etched, and it's not difficult to reawaken it. Whereas if you never had das in the first place, it remained detached. So this is true really in any ideas, but especially the necessity is when you're dealing with divine truths. Because remember, divine is more difficult for us to access. When it comes to physical things, it's very clear. People will go crazy and obsess and be completely consumed with something which may not even be good for them. But when it comes to lakus, which in some ways is more elusive, because we live in a world where the divine is concealed, das plays even a more critical role. So Nefesh Elokis also has this ability to not just understand the divine, not just to conceive, not just to understand Chachma and Bina, and not just to give, and not just Chachma and Bina, but also the das that connects you with it, which is critical to produce healthy, sustainable offspring, in this case emotions, that also have vitality. V'hu koil chesed v'gvura. Then he continues, the Alter Rebbe says, now since we just established that all the emotions are dependent on das, this connection, this intimate connection, so who das incorporates chesed and gvura, and the Alter Rebbe explains what does that mean. It pirush ava vanfer v'yira vanfer. Love and its derivatives, and reverence and its derivatives. So in Kabbalah it talks about that das is the interface, the place where the moichin of das, taking the Chachma and Bina, and as I said before, it bonds Chachma and Bina, it bonds Chachma and Bina to give birth to the emotions. So das itself includes in it chesed and gvura. In the language of Kabbalah, hadas nechlekes the chesed and gvura. Das actually divides between chesed and gvura. That's why sometimes you hear about dalad moichin, that there are 4 moichin, because you're talking about Chachma and Bina, and they correspond to the 4 parshias and the 4 batim in Tefillin, in the Shal Rosh. So he speaks about that the Dal Meichen is because Chachma and Bina, and Das divides into Chesed and Gvura. But Chesed and Gvura, as an inclination of the mind, is now already inclined toward attraction, or the Gvura, which would be toward awe. But it's still in the mind level. So now when you have Chachma and you have Bina, the father and the mother, because if you don't have that, you don't have what you're contemplating on Gedula Sein Sof. But now that you have Chachma and Bina, and you have the bonding that Das connects you with it, it's mine. It's Zayin Tate, it's your father. It's your God. Elokeinu. Not just Elokei Avosenu, or Elokei Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov. Elokeinu. It's my God. So the mind is no longer just a detached, objective observer. It's a personal relationship. That is the bridge to actually create the relationship of the emotions, Ava and Yira. And he says, like he said before, so we have here now, Chesed and Gvura encompasses Chesed and Gvura, which, as the Alter Rebbe explains, Chesed is Ava, and its derivatives, its branches, and Gvura is Yira, and its branches. Similar to what he said before, because he wants to show how all the 10 spheres, all the 10 faculties are all consumed with the divine experience. So this finishes the topic in chapter 3, where now we have that the Chabad, Chochma Bina Das, what he called in the beginning of the chapter, the Shalosh Imos, and the Sheva Kfulas, the 7 emotions, which are derivatives and branches of Chesed and Gvura, of Ava and Yira, are all divine. So now, when you think about your divine soul, it is going to enter a body and an animal soul. It's going to have to contend with all the challenges of life. But it comes well armed. It's not only at its core a divine Chelek Elikam Mal Mamish, a piece of godliness, a piece of God, so to speak. A child that is of the etzem tipus moyechav, of the core of the divine mind, which is connected to the divine essence, as we learned in chapter 2. But also, it's armed with tools, with instruments, with resources, with faculties that are equally divine. Beginning from the mind, chachma and bina, turning it into the emotions, with a das, right in between, that creates the hiskashrus and the hischabrus, that connection that is so vital. Because if someone would argue, God forbid, that we have chachma and bina, and you give birth to emotions, but you're not connected to it, you could say, you know what, the divine soul doesn't have the ability to bond with it, it's then lacking a personalization. So the emotions may be there, but they'll be far more superficial and far more temporary and impermanent. They won't have that vitality. So now das, as that final dimension, that a human being with a neshama, nefesh alekis, has the capacity to conceive, to develop and comprehend in depth, and to bond and connect with that comprehension that is personal, that's his, that's mine, it's negei b'nefesh, because it's relevant to me, which in turn creates true emotions of, number one, awe and love and passion toward this thing which is so negei b'nefesh. The negei b'nefesh turns it into a full different type of experience of emotions. And as we see, when people have emotional stimulation, an emotional awakening, emotional birthing of emotions that comes when it's negei b'nefesh, that it really touches your very core, your life is dependent on it. It's very different emotions than when a person may, there could be different things that stimulate you, entertain you, in some way get you excited, but it's not negei b'nefesh, it's lacking das, so it does not have that vitality. And with this we conclude chapter 3 in Tanya. And then the next Pedic we're going to discuss yet another dimension of the divine soul as it manifests even further outward. So we talked about the etzem haneshama, so-called the core of the divine soul in chapter 2, the faculties, including the elements. In chapter 3, the 10 faculties and the elements of Eish and Mayim. And then we're going to discuss how it manifests and expresses itself through the levushim and the garments. Everyone have a good tavach, a good gebench to yar. This program and all the programs can be seen at TanyaApply.com. You can also pose any questions. Be well and be blessed.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.